Hi, I'm Jason Jaspersen. Welcome to my studio. For this episode of The Process, I'll walk you through the creation of this children's book based on Martin Luther's hymn, A Mighty Fortress. To my knowledge, this is a kind of a startup company. The publishing company is just getting started, and they really want to try to produce a series of books based on Lutheran hymns. So they have a very, very focused market for their products. And I also have a very focused market for the artwork that I make. I try to make work that's really even beyond Christian, specifically Lutheran. I had a false start on this project, in a way. Working with this publisher, we worked out some storyboards. They had some thoughts about how they wanted it to go, and just like any project, you're trying to figure out from the beginning. Sometimes you're trying to figure out together, what should this be? And if you haven't ever really made something, or if you're not sure, if you're not used to making something, you might not realize how little people know what something's going to turn out like. So we were at the beginning of this project, and we had a totally different storyboard. We had a totally different style, a method that was digital, trying to be sort of rustic, and I would say we were 75% done with the project or more, and we kind of pulled the plug on it, decided it isn't working. It just doesn't, it's not hitting the right audience. And in retrospect, I agree with that decision. I look at some of those original illustrations, and they weren't working together well. It wasn't doing it. But I'm really glad that the publisher stuck with me and decided to give it another chance, and we came at it from a different angle. We talked about working with a older age group, which is something that I think my work hits more naturally. I learned from this project that I have a hard time making work for young children. I just tend toward kind of a dramatic flair that sometimes gets intense, I guess. So here's my portrait of Martin Luther with sporting a very sporty beard. He's in this image. He's in hiding as Junker Jorg, Junker George, Knight George. So growing up, he was a big fan of the story of St. George slaying the dragon, and so I kind of did that image of the knight and the dragon as kind of a shout out to Marty's great love. For me, it was Batman. For him, it was St. George. And the reason this book is being published at this time is because Martin Luther, 500 years ago on October 31st, nailed 95 theses to the local church door and kind of changed the course of Western history. And some people say that modern democracy is due to this action. Some people say that all the splits and factions in modern Christianity are due to this. No matter what your view is on this, it was a significant event, and he was a significant character. One of the most important in Western history. So our second go around, I had noticed that the publishers really liked my sketches better than my final work. And my sketches were in an ink wash medium, kind of a watery ink that I often use just for generating ideas. So I thought maybe that's where I should be with my final work. I should use this ink wash method as a more finished approach. So that kind of clicked a couple things in my head, and I realized that I have training in this ink wash method. It's a strong strain in my work. So that worked out much better. Felt very natural. This is an Asian painting method. I learned it from my grandmother, who's Japanese. The word for it is sumi-e, ink painting. And think about using a paintbrush with ink on a paper towel. That's kind of an approximation of the way that this works. So the ink really soaks. It really kind of bleeds into the paper, and whatever you put down is staying. And there's a permanence to every mark. So what this causes in me is kind of a heightened awareness. I'm really paying attention to every load in the brush. I'm paying attention to how much water and how much ink is in the brush, and the speed of my marks and the direction of my marks and that sort of thing. So whereas my first attempt at illustrating this had all the advantages of and all the flexibility of digital work, it had none of the urgency of this very analog process. And I feel like that's what I needed. I needed some of this risk. The Japanese process originated in China, and when I was in high school, my grandmother gave me lessons weekly in her studio. She was a fairly successful painter in Japan, entering competitions in Tokyo and winning prizes, and she's made several beautiful landscapes, kind of representing a bygone era of Japanese culture, farmland, and it's kind of the equivalent of painting barns in America that are falling down, or there's a nostalgia to what she does. The sumi-e paper is actually made from the pulp of mulberry tree bark. It's very, very absorbent. It has long grains that make the water and the ink travel long distances. But it also sometimes makes the paper very kind of waterlogged. And so there are times where I have to wait. I have to just let the painting rest. And so there's a physical need for letting the paper rest so it doesn't just bleed everywhere. But there's also a mental conceptual need for letting myself rest. Looking at something with fresh eyes after a couple days helps me to make judgments that aren't clouded by fatigue. Instead, I'm trying to make decisions that are really best for the paintings. So it's good for me to kind of pulse and pause, to work really hard and then not work on it at all. I think that's a healthy relationship with the artwork. So from what I understand about the Japanese tradition, the artist would take a walk. They would go and experience nature unencumbered by any art supplies or anything like that. You just take a walk, and you pay attention. And you think about what you see, and you think about what you saw as you get home, and you sit down and try to compile all of that and maybe sort of weed out and focus on certain aspects, and then do a painting that sort of for you captures what you saw, what you remember. So there's a different relationship with nature in that, because the artist is really sort of an internalizing filter. They're taking what comes in through their senses and then bringing it out through their hands, and the artist is a really very active interpreter of nature in that case. That's a strong contrast to, say, like the Impressionists. Claude Monet and the Impressionists would go outside with their canvases and paint right there on the spot, and be a faithful optical rendition of what they're seeing at that moment. And so I find it very interesting that both of those traditions are dealing with nature in a very respectful way and in a very different way. This is a painting that my grandmother Iku sent me. I forget how old I was. It might be as young as 5 years old. She was in Japan at the time, and this came in the mail, and it was specifically for me, and I just thought that was amazing that I own art. I thought it was very special. My parents helped me realize, that this is a significant object. But it hung in my room growing up, and so I had plenty of time with it. And I think that's a really important aspect of art, that it's something that isn't for special occasions. It should be something that you live with daily and have repeated exposure to. So, this simple little landscape kind of burned itself into my memory. And so I studied it. I studied the way that the mountains in the background fade. They're a lighter color than everything in the foreground. And they're really just a little bit of a soak. They're really just a light ink here. And up in the foreground, we've got a lot more complexity and sort of layering happening. I remember realizing that, hey, this is a great way to show water instead of like a big oval for a lake. Look at this. This sort of sticks out and it kind of hides some of the water, and this sort of sticks out and it hides, and we got this zigzag here. And so, something like this had a profound effect on me as a child. And this is really exactly what I'm doing for this book. It's the exact same materials and technique, but modified for the content. This is her signature, and then this is what's called her Hanko stamp. And that's sort of like a wax seal that somebody might have to seal an envelope or a letter to let you know that it's actually theirs. This idea, this Hanko, directly influences my logo. So my grandma gave me this kind of container, this pad of ink, when I was in high school 20-some years ago, and it's still good. Look at that color. This is sort of a pasty, thick, sticky ink. And here's my signature stamp. And we kind of put it in here and get some of this, and you can kind of see how that works. So this is a picture of my grandfather that I made out of stamps from Japan. Grandpa was a missionary in Japan for his whole career. So this is called The Boy from Fond du Lac, but it's full of Japanese stamps, and it's really about him in kind of his later years, thinking back to his two homes. He was just a boy from Wisconsin, and trying to figure out maybe what is home. So he met my grandmother in Japan, and they married and had a family. And because he was from America, the kids came to America for school when they were late grade school, early high school. They lived with host families, went to boarding school, and that's how my grandmother's from Japan and I'm from Minnesota. So I've got one of my paintings here. These you can see by the book and the paintings, the paintings are quite a bit larger than the actual book, the final. And because these are so large, I needed help getting them digitized. I scanned them into a digital format. I scanned them, and my daughter stitched several scans together. My scanner wasn't large enough to hold these large pieces of paper all in one, so we had to scan several pieces. And my daughter has become pretty good at stitching all of these together in Photoshop so they all match up so you can't see the seams. So once they're digital, I'm able to look at them and work with them differently. I go into Photoshop and kind of judiciously add some effects and some color. I did not want the ink painting to get overwhelmed with digital effects, but I did want to take advantage of sort of the magic of digital work in a storytelling way. A good friend was looking at the work as I was doing it and gave me some advice about making maybe making a color change between good and evil. So another decision that I made digitally was that I could put kind of a signifier on Jesus. Every page that he appears, there's a halo, like a rainbow halo, and that's sort of a biblical take. When he's described or heaven is described, very often there's sort of a spectrum described or a rainbow. So I wanted kind of this subtle like follow on each page, that these are sort of different incarnations or reimagined versions of Jesus. So we've got this ancient, very analog, unforgiving medium in the sumi-e painting that requires a certain kind of touch and experience, and then at the tail end of this project, I'm working in a kind of a digital medium that is relatively young and actually fairly forgiving. I guess I've learned over the years that I'm not really a purist. I have no problem with taking this ancient medium and applying a really contemporary treatment to it, because I think that might be where new things happen. Applying a fresh perspective to a timeless truth, that's kind of the tagline that I've started to take on. So this hymn, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," has been one of my favorite hymns growing up. It kind of plays with my fascination with heroes and villains and the kind of battle. It's really all about a battle, but it's a spiritual battle. And so, as I often have to do, I was faced with the challenge of how to make invisible interior things visible. So some of the challenges I had here were trying to be very clear in the imagery about what does good look like and what does evil look like in the context of this story. I did some research. I watched some Tolkien movies, just like studying the Weta work and trying to figure out how did they make these decisions about how to make good and evil visually distinct. There are colors, there are design decisions that I kind of tagged onto in some ways. As you're looking through this book, you might see a color change here. We have, in this sort of diagonal area, we've got the church and people sort of walking towards it. And up here we've got this green sort of marching over and kind of a cloud coming over. And that kind of became a visual distinction that I explored. So here again you see this color change. And here again in a radial pattern radiating out. Another interesting thing is theologically, you have the hero here as this harmless kind of unlikely hero against, it might be hard to see on the camera, but against these sort of armed, spiky, thorny, ominous looking characters, and they're being defeated by this very unlikely hero. And again, an unlikely hero, a criminal being tortured, defeating this army. So you have this very sort of contrasty way of interpreting things. The hymn talks very heroically about Jesus as the hero, and I struggled with how do you actually depict that. And so in this image, I think I have the closest thing to a heroic knight in shining armor. This sort of battle royale between the knight and the dragon. The publisher decided on this last page to include God's Word as our great heritage, and so I illustrated sort of this generational image showing a child kind of in the arms of a parent. So that's an interesting concept. They say that any belief system is one generation away from being lost, and so this is sort of my effort to try to do my part to preserve this tradition.